Hi and welcome to my channel. Boston's suburbs brimmed with late summer energy as we hosted our annual barbecue. The Brysons' backyard became a hub for laughter, smoky grills, and the clinking of lemonade glasses. Paul, my best friend of over 15 years, stood out among the crowd as he always did, easily engaging with neighbors and family alike. My wife Clara, the ever-gracious host, fluttered between guests, her effortless charm on full display. It wasn't until a week later, during an unusually tense evening, that my world began to shift. Lily, my 15-year-old daughter, and Jacob, my 12-year-old son, hovered awkwardly in the living room, their fidgeting betraying an unease they hadn't shown before. "All right," I said, lowering myself onto the couch. "What's going on? You two look like you've got something on your minds." Lily bit her lip, a tell she'd picked up from Clara. Jacob, uncharacteristically quiet, nudged her as if urging her to speak first. Finally, Lily took a deep breath. "Dad, it's about Mom," she began, her voice wavering. The words hung in the air. I tensed. "What about her?" Jacob burst out, his words tumbling over one another. "We saw her at the barbecue with Uncle Paul. They were kissing." Silence engulfed the room, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mind reeled. Kissing. My voice was sharp, disbelief evident. Lily nodded, her expression somber. "We saw them behind the fence by the hammock. They were close, hugging. Then they kissed." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the couch as if it were the only thing grounding me. "Did they see you?" "No," Jacob replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "We hid." Denying their words seemed easier than accepting them, but my children had no reason to fabricate something so devastating. "Thank you for telling me," I managed. "I'll handle this." With assurances that they were not to worry about the matter, I sent them to their rooms. But the damage was done. The betrayal, stark and surreal, was impossible to ignore. That night, I lay awake beside Clara, staring at the ceiling as her steady breaths mocked the chaos in my mind. Paul, Clara, a moment I couldn't yet prove, but couldn't unsee through my children's recounting. Questions plagued me. How long? Why? What did it mean for our family? The next morning, the usual rhythm of our weekend routine felt discordant. Clara hummed softly as she flipped pancakes, her movements fluid and cheerful. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the epitome of domestic bliss, but to me, her casual demeanor was like salt on a wound. "Good morning," she chirped, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "Morning," I muttered, sipping my coffee to avoid meeting her eyes. Every movement she made seemed calculated, rehearsed. Was this how she always acted, or was this newfound clarity warping my perception of her? She leaned against the counter, nibbling at a slice of toast. "I was thinking we could head to the farmer's market later. Pick up some fresh produce for the week." "Maybe," I replied curtly. Her smile faltered, just for a moment, before she recovered. "Well, let me know. I thought it'd be nice to spend some time together. We've both been so busy." Her words stung, their irony blatant. My stomach churned as I wondered if Paul had occupied that time she claimed was so scarce. I forced myself to finish breakfast and excuse myself to the garage under the pretense of needing to organize tools. Instead, I leaned against the workbench, my mind spinning with questions and an emerging plan. I had to know for sure. After a quick shower, I returned to the kitchen, where Clara was packing reusable bags for the market. "You know," I said casually, "I might take the car for a drive. Just clear my head a little." Clara paused, looking up. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, elite. Just feeling restless." "It's nothing." She didn't press, and I left, my heart pounding as I navigated toward Paul's neighborhood. Parking a block away from his house, I felt ridiculous, like some second-rate detective in a poorly written crime drama. But the need for answers propelled me forward. His house, a modest two-story with a neatly trimmed lawn, seemed innocuous enough. Through the partially open blinds, I saw movement in the living room. Clara had said she was staying home for the day, yet the silhouette pacing inside looked disturbingly familiar. I crouched low, moving closer, until I caught a clear glimpse of the figure. It wasn't Clara, but Paul, his phone pressed to his ear. His agitated gestures suggested frustration. "Just be careful. We can't let him find out like this." Paul's voice carried faintly through the window. I strained to hear more, but the sound of a car doors slamming nearby startled me, forcing me to retreat into the shadows. As I drove away, my mind raced with possibilities. Paul's words were ambiguous, but the implication was damning. My suspicions were no longer abstract. They were sharpening into certainty. If Clara wasn't with Paul at that moment, then they were at least conspiring to keep something from me. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, struggling to act normal when I returned home. Clara didn't seem to notice my distraction, or perhaps she chose not to acknowledge it. That night, I replayed every interaction, every detail, searching for cracks I might have missed before. The next step was clear. I needed undeniable proofs. By Monday, I had resolved to uncover the truth. The weight of uncertainty was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't confront Clara without hard evidence. That morning, while Clara showered, I took a calculated risk. Her phone was charging on the nightstand, face down, its screen dark. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the faint buzz of water in the pipes providing the background hum of a timer ticking down. Unlocking her phone was easy. We'd always shared passcodes, a remnant of our once unshakable trust. Her texts were mundane, messages from her book club, reminders about the kids' appointments, but it was her emails that made my pulse quicken. There it was, a thread from a Paolo business account, thinly veiled in its attempt at discretion. The last message read, "I'll call you tonight after Alan goes to bed. We need to talk about the next steps. I can't keep pretending much longer." I scrolled further, finding nothing blatantly incriminating, but plenty of breadcrumbs leading back to Paul. My chest tightened. Was this his alias? How brazen could they be? The shower stopped, jolting me from my thoughts. I replaced the phone and left the room before Clara could catch me, but my mind raced. That evening, I contacted an old college buddy, Mike, who worked as a private investigator. He was blunt as always. "Alan," he said, "if you're going to do this, don't half-ass it. You want peace of mind or ammo for a fight?" "Both," I admitted. Mike chuckled darkly. "All right. First step, GPS tracking on her phone and car. Second, I'll set up a basic surveillance plan. Give me a week." A week felt like an eternity, but I agreed. When I hung up, my hands were clammy, the gravity of my decision sinking in. The week crawled by. Clara's behavior didn't change. If anything, she seemed more attentive, more affectionate. Each gesture felt hollow, as if she were overcompensating for something. The dissonance between her actions and what I suspected ate at me. Friday evening, Mike called. His voice was uncharacteristically somber. "You're not going to like this." "What did you find?" "She met with him yesterday at the Oak Ridge Inn. His car was parked there for over 4 hours. I got photos, timestamps. It's clear they weren't there for a business meeting." My stomach twisted. The Oak Ridge Inn, a boutique hotel nestled on the edge of town, was the same place Clara and I had spent our anniversary 3 years ago. The irony was brutal. "Alan, I can dig deeper if you want, but from where I'm sitting, this is a slam dunk." I thanked him, my voice hollow, and hung up. The confirmation was like a knife twisting in my chest. There was no misinterpretation, no chance of error. Clara and Paul had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. I didn't confront Clara immediately. Instead, I spent the night pacing the house, formulating a plan. The confrontation couldn't be impulsive. I needed to control the narrative, not let my anger dictate my actions. By morning, I had a plan, and it was going to be more than just a confrontation. I wasn't going to let this betrayal break me. I would turn it into a reckoning. Saturday morning dawned sharp and cool, the kind of autumn day that would normally lift my spirits. But as I sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee and staring at the pale light filtering through the blinds, my mind was already racing ahead to what I needed to do. Clara entered the room, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled in a way that once made me feel at home. Today, it only deepened the ache in my chest. "You're up early," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "What's the plan for today?" "I was thinking we could spend some time as a family," I said, careful to keep my voice light. "Maybe a picnic in the park?" Her eyes flickered with what I thought was hesitation before she smiled. "That sounds nice. Let me get the kids up." I nodded, watching her leave the room. This wasn't a day for genuine bonding. It was a setup. I needed one last act to confirm my suspicions, to put her in a position where her lies could no longer hold. By mid-afternoon, we were spread out on a blanket in Franklin Park, the kids tossing a frisbee while Clara and I shared sandwiches. The air was crisp, the trees alive with color. It felt absurdly idyllic, like a scene ripped from a movie. It was almost enough to make me doubt myself, to question whether I was overreacting. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and quickly turned it over, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah, just a reminder from the yoga studio about tomorrow's class," she said too quickly. I nodded, saying nothing, but my stomach churned. It was the reaction I'd been waiting for. Later that evening, when Clara left to run errands, I put the final stage of my plan into motion. The GPS tracker Mike had installed on her car gave me her location in real time, a parking lot near Oak Ridge Inn. I called Mike, who was already nearby with his camera equipment. "She's at the inn again," I said, my voice cold. "You know what to do." "Already in position," he replied. I didn't wait for his report. Instead, I drove to Paul's house, arriving just as his car pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, looking smug and relaxed, until he saw me standing there. His expression froze, his keys clinking in his hand. "Alan," he started, forcing a smile. "What brings you here?" "You know why I'm here," I said, stepping closer. My voice was calm, but the rage simmering beneath was impossible to miss. Paul paled. "Look, I don't know what you've heard." "Save it," I snapped, cutting him off. "I don't need to hear your excuses. I have proof. I know about you and Clara. I know about the Oak Ridge Inn." His face twisted, a mix of panic and guilt. "Alan, it's not what you think." "Really? Because what I think is that my best friend has been screwing my wife behind my back. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me." Paul stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I laughed bitterly. "How exactly was it supposed to happen, Paul? Enlighten me." He said nothing, his silence speaking louder than any words. I turned and walked back to my car, leaving him standing there, ashen-faced. There was no need to escalate further. Not yet. The real confrontation was still to come. When Clara returned home that night, I was waiting in the living room, the photos Mike had taken spread out on the coffee table. She froze in the doorway, her eyes darting to the evidence before meeting mine. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. But it wasn't fear for me or our family. It was fear for herself. Clara stood motionless in the doorway, her breath shallow as her eyes darted between the photographs on the coffee table and my face. Her confident veneer crumbled before my eyes, replaced by a pale mask of panic. "Alan," she started, her voice trembling. "I can explain." I scoffed, leaning back in the chair with my arms crossed. "Explain what, Clara? The multiple trips to the Oak Ridge Inn? The texts, the emails, the lies? Go ahead. I'm dying to hear this." She hesitated, then slowly walked into the room, each step deliberate, as though she was approaching a cliff's edge. Sitting down on the edge of the couch, she looked at me, her expression pleading. "It wasn't like that," she said. "Paul and I. Don't." I cut her off, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't insult me with some sanitized version of the truth. My kids came to me last week, Clara. They saw you at the barbecue. That's where it started." Her eyes widened in shock, and her hands flew to her mouth. "The kids." "Yes, the kids. Your actions didn't just hurt me, Clara. You betrayed them too." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. This wasn't the time for pity. She tried again, but I cut her off once more. "How long has it been going on?" I asked coldly. Her gaze fell to the floor, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence was unbearable, the weight of it pressing down on the room like a suffocating blanket. 6 months, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of sneaking around with my best friend. Do you have any idea how pathetic that makes me feel? Clara looked up, her tears spilling over. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I was lonely, Alan. You're always so busy with work, with everything else." I felt invisible. Invisible. I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "So, your solution was to have an affair with the one person I trusted most in this world? If you were so lonely, why not talk to me? Why not work on fixing what we had?" Her tears turned into sobs, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't know how, she choked out. It just had happened. I stared at her, a strange numbness creeping in where my anger had been. It didn't just happen, Clara. You made choices. Every time you texted him, every time you met him, every lie you told, it was a choice. For a moment, the only sound in the room was her muffled crying. Finally, I stood, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a physical force. I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket. Don't wait up. I drove aimlessly for an hour, the city lights blurring into streaks of color as my mind raced. The betrayal, the lies, the cavalier way she tried to justify it. It was all too much. By the time I pulled into a quiet park and killed the engine, my hands were shaking. I sat there in silence, staring at the empty playground, and replayed the entire conversation in my head. Her excuses, her tears, they only confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't something that could be fixed. Too much damage had been done. But as much as I wanted to walk away, I knew it wasn't that simple. There were the kids to think about, the house, the life we'd built. Unraveling all of that wouldn't just hurt me. It would destroy them too. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady my thoughts. If I was going to move forward, I needed to be smart. Clara had played her hand, but the game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. I stayed in the car for hours, long enough for the night air to turn icy. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts and calls from Clara, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. When I finally returned home, the house was silent, dark except for the dim light above the stove. Clara wasn't in the living room or kitchen, but I could hear the faint hum of the TV upstairs. I crept up the stairs, my movements quiet as I passed the kids' rooms. Lily's door was slightly ajar, her bedside lamp casting a soft glow. She was curled up with a book, her headphones in. She noticed me and pulled one side off. "Hey, Dad," she said softly. "Hey, sweetheart. Everything okay?" She nodded, her face hesitant. "I heard Mom crying earlier. Is everything all right?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It will be," I said finally. "Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Lil." I ruffled her hair and closed her door, the interaction cutting deeper than any confrontation with Clara ever could. This wasn't just about us. It was about them, too. The next morning, Clara was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Her eyes were red and swollen, evidence of a sleepless night. She looked up as I entered, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. "Alan and I." "Not now," I interrupted. "The kids are going to be up soon." She nodded, biting her lip, but her eyes were pleading. I grabbed my own coffee and left the room before she could say more. Sunday was a blur of forced normalcy. The kids were none the wiser as we went about our day, Clara and I navigating conversations like landmines. I couldn't bear to look at her for too long, and every casual interaction felt like a charade. That evening, after the kids went to bed, I sat Clara down in the living room. She perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Here's how this is going to go," I began, my voice firm. "We're going to tell the kids together, but only after we've figured out the logistics. I won't let them be blindsided by this." Clara's lip quivered, but she nodded. "Okay, I've contacted a lawyer," I continued. "We'll start working out the details this week. I want joint custody, and I expect you to be cooperative. For their sake." "Alan, please," she said, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but don't let it end like this. Please, we can fix this." I shook my head, the anger bubbling up again. "Fix this? How do you propose we do that, Clara? You broke something that can't be put back together. And frankly, I'm not sure I even want to try." Her tears came again, but I didn't stay to watch. I left the room, her sobs echoing faintly behind me as I climbed the stairs. The next day, I met with Mike at a coffee shop. He handed me a thick envelope containing everything he'd gathered. Photos, timestamps, even transcripts of some text exchanges between Clara and Paul. I stared at the evidence, my stomach churning. "This is enough to leverage a favorable settlement," Mike said. "You'll come out of this on top, Alan." "Thanks, Mike," I said, sliding the envelope into my bag. "I owe you one." "Just take care of yourself," he replied. "And the kids." That evening, I sent Paul a text. "We need to talk. Tonight. My house. 8 p.m. When he arrived, his usual confident swagger was absent. He looked nervous, his eyes darting as he stepped inside. "What's this about, Alan?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "You know what this is about," I said, closing the door behind him. I gestured to the dining table, where the photos and transcripts were spread out. "Take a look." Paul's face turned ashen as he flipped through the pages. "Alan and I." "Save it," I said, my voice cold. "You've already said enough. You've betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now you're going to pay for it." His eyes widened in alarm. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're going to tell your wife everything. Tonight. Or I will." Paul's hands shook as he set the papers down. "You don't have to do this." "Oh, but I do," I said, leaning in. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed my family. And I'm not going to let you walk away unscathed." Paul's lips parted as if to argue, but he said nothing. Instead, he nodded, his face pale. "Fine, I'll tell her." "Good," I said, straightening. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." When Paul left, I felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation was only the beginning, but it was a step toward reclaiming some semblance of control over the wreckage Clara and Paul had left in their wake. The next phase of my plan was about to begin. 2 days later, I sat down with Clara at the dining table, the kids safely at school. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. She had been avoiding me as much as I had her, but now there was no escape. This was the meeting that would determine the terms of our fallout. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I began, sliding a folder across the table to her. "These are the initial terms I'm proposing. Read through them carefully." Clara hesitated before picking up the folder. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. "Joint custody," she murmured. "But the kids stay in the house?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll move out for now, but only temporarily. I want the kids' lives disrupted as little as possible." "And us?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. I stared at her, letting the silence hang in the air before responding. "There is no us, Clara. Not anymore." Her tears started again, but I didn't flinch. She had already cried enough to fill an ocean, and it hadn't changed anything. I watched as she reached for a tissue, dabbing at her eyes before flipping another page. "These financial arrangements," she paused, her brow furrowed. "They're generous. More generous than you deserve," I replied coldly. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the kids." She nodded, her shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. "I'll sign," she whispered. "I don't want to fight you on this, Alan. I just want to try to make things right." "There's no making this right," I said, rising from the table. "But at least you're finally showing some sense." That evening, I drove to Paul's house, parking a block away to avoid being seen. The confrontation 2 nights earlier had been cathartic, but there was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to secure. His wife, Linda, answered the door, her face lighting up with surprise. "Alan, what a nice surprise. Come in." I stepped inside, scanning the pristine living room that felt eerily similar to my own. Linda gestured to the couch, but I stayed standing. "Is Paul here?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Her smile faltered. "No, he's still at work." "Why? Is something wrong?" I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what came next. "Linda, there's something you need to know. It's about Paul and Clara." Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to concern. "What about them?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a smaller folder, one containing the most damning pieces of evidence Mike had collected. "I didn't want you to hear this from someone else," I said, handing it to her. "But you deserve the truth." Linda's hands trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the photographs and transcripts. Her face went pale, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. This can't be real." "I wish it wasn't," I said quietly. "But it is, and I thought you should know." She dropped the folder onto the coffee table, burying her face in her hands. "How long?" she choked out. 6 months, I said. "Maybe longer." Linda sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I stood there awkwardly, unsure whether to comfort her or leave her to process the betrayal. After a moment, she looked up, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes filled with determination. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's going to regret this." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. "If there's anything you need, let me know. You're not alone in this." As I left her house, I felt an odd mix of emotions, satisfaction at having exposed Paul, but also a lingering sadness for Linda, who had been as blindsided by this betrayal as I had. Still, this was far from over. Back home, I found Clara in the kitchen, her face drawn and weary. I told Linda. I said bluntly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. You told her? She deserved to know, I said. Just like I did. Clara opened her mouth to protest, then closed it, as if realizing there was nothing she could say to defend herself. For the first time, I saw real remorse in her eyes, not just for what she'd done, but for the wreckage she'd left behind. But it was too late for remorse. The damage was done, and the fallout was just beginning. The fallout from my confrontation with Linda began almost immediately. The next morning, Clara and I were greeted by the sharp rapping of knuckles against our front door. When I opened it, Paul stood there, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, anger, desperation, and the unmistakable sting of humiliation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart already pounding. Clara emerged from the kitchen, freezing mid-step when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice wavering. Paul glared at her, then turned to me. "You had no right to tell Linda." "No right," I echoed, laughing bitterly. "You screwed my wife, lied to your own, and you think I don't have the right to expose you?" Clara's face turned white, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. "Paul, you should go," she whispered, her tone pleading. "No," I said, stepping between them. "He's not going anywhere. Let him explain why I was wrong to tell Linda." Paul ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "You don't understand what you've done, Alan. Linda's talking about taking the kids and moving out. She's threatening to ruin me. Everything I've worked for." "Good," I shot back. "Maybe you'll get a small taste of what you and Clara have put me through." Paul turned to Clara, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone. "Clara, you have to fix this. Tell Alan it wasn't serious, that it's over." I laughed again, the sound sharp and bitter. "She's not fixing anything, Paul. You've both made your choices. Now you deal with the consequences." Paul looked back and forth between us, realizing there was no salvation here. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving Clara and me in a silence that felt heavier than before. That evening, Linda called. Her voice was steady but cold, a tone I hadn't heard from her in all the years we'd known each other. "Alan, I filed for divorce," she said. "Thank you for giving me the clarity I needed." "Linda, I'm sorry you had to go through this," I said, meaning every word. "If there's anything I can do—" "There isn't," she interrupted. "But I appreciate the offer. You take care of yourself, Alan." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone, the reality of her decision sinking in. Linda was cutting ties, refusing to let Paul drag her down with him. Part of me admired her decisiveness, but it also brought my own situation into sharper focus. I wasn't sure if I could be as resolute. The next day, I sat down with my lawyer, Megan, a no-nonsense professional who wasted no time cutting to the chase. "Alan, you've got a strong case for joint custody and favorable asset division," she said, flipping through the stack of evidence I provided. "But I need to ask, what do you want out of this? Are you looking for reconciliation, or is this about closure?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I'm not looking to fix things," I said finally. "I just want what's best for the kids. They deserve stability." Megan nodded. "Then we proceed as planned. We'll finalize the terms for custody and division of assets. With the evidence we have, Clara is in no position to contest." Her words brought a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had the upper hand, but the victory felt hollow. This wasn't a battle I wanted to win. Back home, Clara tried once more to bridge the growing chasm between us. She cornered me in the living room, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Alan, I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. "But I love you. I love our family. Please, let's try to fix this." I looked at her, the woman I had once built my entire world around, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. "You love me?" I asked, my voice low. "You love me while you snuck around with Paul? You loved me while you lied to our kids, to my face?" Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I pressed on. "Love isn't just words, Clara. It's actions. and your actions have destroyed everything we built." She sank to her knees, her sobs racking her body. "I'll do anything," she whispered. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you." But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I walked past her, heading for the stairs. "The papers are being drawn up," I said over my shoulder. "You can either sign them peacefully, or we can drag this out. But one way or another, this marriage is over." Her cries followed me up the stairs, but I didn't look back. The door to our room closed behind me, shutting out the sound of her despair. This was the beginning of the end, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of clarity. In the days that followed, the house was a minefield of suppressed emotions. Clara tiptoed around me, her attempts at conversation faltering before they could gain traction. The kids sensed the tension, their usual chatter reduced to wary glances and whispered exchanges. I hated what this was doing to them, but there was no undoing the damage. On Friday evening, I called a family meeting. Clara's eyes widened when I announced it over dinner, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. Lily and Jacob exchanged nervous looks, but obediently followed us to the living room. "What's going on, Dad?" Jacob asked, his voice edged with apprehension. I took a deep breath, the weight of what I was about to say pressing heavily on my chest. "Kids, your mom and I need to talk to you about something important." Clara looked at me, her expression pleading, but I ignored her. This was my responsibility to handle, and I wasn't going to let her deflect or sugarcoat. "Your mom and we're going to be separating," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "This isn't something we planned, and I know it's going to be hard to understand, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault." Jacob frowned, his eyes darting to Clara. "Why? Why are you separating?" Lily, ever perceptive, spoke up before Clara could answer. "It's because of what we told you, isn't it?" Clara's breath hitched, and I felt the sting of her panic, but I nodded. "Yes, Lily. What you saw was the beginning of a bigger problem. Your mom made some choices that hurt our family." Jacob's face crumpled, and he looked at Clara with a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "Mom, is it true?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she nodded, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Jacob turned to me, his voice trembling with anger. "What's going to happen to us?" I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him. "We're going to work through this as a family," I said. "You and Lily will stay here in the house. Mom and I will figure out how to make this as smooth as possible for you." Lily folded her arms, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Smooth?" she said, her voice cold. "You think this is going to be smooth? How do you expect us to trust anything you say, Mom?" "Lily, please," Clara begged. "I know I've hurt you, but I love you. Both of you. That hasn't changed." Lily stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Love isn't lying to us," she said, her voice sharp. "It isn't sneaking around. You ruined everything, Mom." Jacob followed her lead, standing and retreating toward the stairs. "We don't want to hear it," he muttered, his voice thick with tears. I watched them go, the sound of their doors slamming echoing through the house. Clara collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "This is worse than I thought," she sobbed. "They hate me. They don't hate you," I said flatly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "But you've broken their trust, and it's going to take a long time to repair." Clara looked up at me, her eyes desperate. "What do I do, Alan? How do I fix this?" I shook my head, the exhaustion of the past few weeks finally catching up to me. "That's for you to figure out, Clara. I'm done carrying the weight of your decisions." Over the next week, I began the process of moving out. I rented a small apartment not far from the kids' school, a temporary solution until the divorce was finalized. Packing my things was surreal, each item a reminder of the life we built and the cracks that had brought it crashing down. On the day I left, Clara stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. "Alan," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I know you don't believe me, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." I paused, my suitcase in hand, and looked at her. "Maybe," I said, "but you can't undo what's already been done." With that, I walked out, leaving her standing alone in the doorway. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments. The kids visited me on weekends, our time together bittersweet as we navigated our new normal. Clara tried to engage with them, but their resentment was palpable, their responses curt and guarded. One evening, Lily stayed behind after Jacob returned to his room. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you think things will ever go back to how they were?" I looked at her, my heart breaking for the innocence she'd lost. "No, Lily," I said honestly, "but that doesn't mean we can't find a new way to be happy." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I hope so." As I hugged her, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about the kids or the logistics of co-parenting. It was about finding a way forward one step at a time, even when the path seemed impossible. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly a new routine took shape. Clara remained in the house with the kids during the week while I adjusted to life in the small apartment nearby. I kept the space sparse, focusing more on making it welcoming for Lily and Jacob when they visited. The time with them became my anchor, a reminder of what mattered most. One Saturday, as we were working on a jigsaw puzzle in my living room, Lily suddenly blurted out, "Have you talked to Uncle Paul?" The question hit me like a blow to the gut. I froze, carefully placing a puzzle piece before answering. "No, I haven't." Jacob frowned. "Are you ever going to? I mean, he was like family." I emphasized, my voice firmer than I intended. What Paul did cross the line. Some things you can't come back from. The room went quiet, the weight of my words hanging heavy. Lily nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Jacob's face remained clouded with confusion. He was too young to fully grasp the complexities of betrayal, and I didn't want to burden him with more than he could handle. The next major hurdle came in the form of Clara's lawyer, a smug man who tried to push for more custody time and a larger financial settlement than we'd agreed upon. I was livid when Megan called to inform me. "She's reneging on the terms," Megan said bluntly. "We can fight it, but it's going to get ugly." I gritted my teeth, the betrayal cutting even deeper. Clara had promised to cooperate, to put the kids first. Now, it seemed she was only thinking of herself. "Do whatever you have to," I said. "I'm not giving up time with my kids." When I confronted Clara, she initially denied, knowing her lawyer had pushed for the changes. "Alan, I didn't ask him to do that," she said, her voice panicked. "I swear, I told him to stick to the original agreement." "Then you'd better rein him in," I snapped. "Because if this goes to court, I'll make sure everything comes out. Every text, every photo. Do you really want the kids dragged through that?" Her face crumpled, and she nodded. "I'll fix it." She did, though the damage to my trust was irreparable. Megan negotiated a revised agreement, and we avoided court, but the bitterness lingered. It wasn't until Christmas that the reality of our fractured family truly hit home. Clara and I agreed to split the holiday. She'd have the kids in the morning, and I'd take them in the afternoon. When I arrived to pick them up, the house was filled with the familiar scent of pine and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the hollow atmosphere. Jacob greeted me enthusiastically, his arms filled with new toys. Lily followed more quietly, her gaze darting between Clara and me. Clara stood by the tree, clutching a mug of cocoa. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Merry Christmas," I replied stiffly. The awkwardness was unbearable, but I wasn't about to cause a scene in front of the kids. We loaded into the car, and as I pulled out of the driveway, Jacob chattered about his presence, oblivious to the tension. Lily, however, was silent, her eyes focused on the snowy landscape outside. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked. She shrugged. "It just feels weird, like we're pretending." Her words cut deep, but I forced a smile. "We're all still figuring this out," I said, "but as long as we're together, that's what matters." She nodded, though her expression remained pensive. Later that evening, as the kids drifted off to sleep, I sat alone by the small Christmas tree in my apartment, staring at the twinkling lights. My mind replayed the events of the past months, the betrayal, the confrontation, the painful conversations with Lily and Jacob. I thought about Clara, about the woman I'd loved for so long and the person she'd become. A part of me wanted to hate her, to let that anger consume me, but another part, a quieter, more exhausted part, just wanted peace. Not for her, but for myself and the kids. I picked up my phone and typed out a message. "We need to figure out how to work together better, for them if nothing else. Let's talk after the holidays." I hesitated before hitting send, the bitterness in my chest warring with a desire to move forward. Finally, I pressed the button, the message disappearing into the ether. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for reconciliation, but for healing for all of us. The new year came and went in an uneasy truce. Clara and I managed to maintain a surface-level civility for the kids' sake, though every interaction felt like navigating a minefield. By February, the divorce proceedings were nearing their final stages, and I found myself clinging to the hope that once the papers were signed, I could finally put it all behind me. But life had other plans. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I was at work when Megan called, her tone sharper than usual. "Alan, are you sitting down?" My chest tightened. "What's wrong?" "It's about Clara," she said, pausing. "She's been taken into custody." "Custody?" I repeated, my heart pounding. "For what?" Megan hesitated. "Attempted arson. Apparently, she tried to burn down Paul's house." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What? Why?" "I don't have all the details yet," she admitted, "but it seems they had some kind of falling out. Paul's wife, Linda, was home at the time. She called the police." My head swam as I tried to process the information. Clara, the woman I had shared my life with for over a decade, had reached a level of desperation I couldn't have imagined. "What about the kids?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're safe," Megan assured me. "Clara's mother has them for now." "But Alan, this complicates things. A lot." I drove to the police station that evening, needing answers. Clara sat in a small holding cell, her once polished appearance disheveled. Her eyes were red and swollen, but when she saw me, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed her face. "What the hell happened, Clara?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "Paul betrayed me. He promised we'd figure things out together, but after you told Linda, everything fell apart. He cut me off, said he never wanted to see me again. And your solution was to torch his house?" I snapped, disbelief and anger warring within me. "Do you even realize what you've done? To him, to Linda, to the kids?" Tears streamed down her face. "I wasn't thinking," she sobbed. "I was angry, Alan. Angry at him, at myself, at everything." I shook my head, the anger giving way to a deep, weary sadness. "This isn't about anger anymore, Clara. This is about consequences. You've destroyed any chance of moving forward." She reached for me through the bars, her voice desperate. "Please, Alan, help me. For the kids." I stepped back, her words cutting like a knife. "You should have thought about them before you did this." The news of Clara's arrest spread quickly, rippling through our small community. The whispers and sideways glances were relentless, turning every trip to the grocery store or school event into an exercise in endurance. Linda, emboldened by Clara's downfall, filed a restraining order and launched a public tirade, leaving no doubt about Clara's guilt. The kids, oblivious at first, began to pick up on the tension. Jacob came to me one evening, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, is Mom in trouble?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your mom made a mistake," I said carefully, "but we're going to get through this. Together." "But what if she goes to jail?" he asked, his voice trembling. I pulled him into a hug, my heart breaking for him. "Then we'll keep going, just like we always do. I promise." The trial came quickly, a surreal spectacle that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Paul testified, recounting the events with a mix of indignation and self-pity, while Linda painted a vivid picture of Clara's erratic behavior in the months leading up to the incident. Clara's lawyer did his best, but the evidence was damning. In the end, Clara was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after one. The gavel's final strike echoed in my ears as I watched her being led away, her once bright spirit reduced to a shadow of itself. The kids struggled in the aftermath, their anger and confusion manifesting in ways I wasn't always prepared for. Lily grew distant, burying herself in schoolwork and shutting me out, while Jacob lashed out, his once innocent questions giving way to pointed accusations. "Why didn't you stop her?" he shouted one evening, tears streaming down his face. "Why didn't you fix it?" I wanted to tell him that I'd tried, that I'd done everything I could, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as he sobbed against my chest. Months later, as I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of everything finally caught up with me. The marriage, the betrayal, the chaos. It had all led to this, a hollow existence that felt more like survival than living. But as I looked at a photo of Lily and Jacob, their smiles frozen in happier times, I knew I had to keep going. For them, if nothing else. The road ahead would be long and painful, but I owed it to them to keep walking it, one step at a time. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow. Goodbye.